Welcome to Richplanet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. On today's programme, I am going to be discussing something which has become one of the most influential entities on the world stage governing public perception of world politics. The organisation known as WikiLeaks, with the help of mainstream media via its leaking of government and corporate documents, seems now to be dictating the direction of world agendas to a significant degree. But is WikiLeaks what it really purports to be? Scratch the surface and you find a completely different picture. Who is Julian Assange really? And who is he really serving? To help me unravel this issue and get closer to the truth, I'd like to welcome back once again Andrew Johnson. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks very much for inviting me back, Richard.
Okay, so a very topical subject matter, Andrew. So just to go right up to recent times first, with regards one of the latest WikiLeaks leaks, the Podesta Clinton emails. Just give us your thoughts on that.
Yes, well, this is something that has been heavily put out in the media, and we were discussing before we started recording how WikiLeaks seems to have come to prominence again during the last US election, speaking now in the middle of 2017. So obviously in the run-up to that election, we had the whole Clinton campaign, which was essentially being influenced by the WikiLeaks stories that were coming out in the media with the Hillary Clinton emails and the Podesta emails, which were heavily featured. I think there was something like 33,000 or something emails or something from Clinton's side that WikiLeaks claimed to have been, a party to and had copies of. So that was very significant in the election of the most powerful figure in the world.
Ostensibly most
Ostensibly,
powerful.
Ostensibly, yeah. So, that right there shows the level to which WikiLeaks has now been put on the world stage.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, in today's programme, we're not really going to talk too much detail about the leaks themselves. This is more about WikiLeaks as an organisation and who is Julian Assange. Just one thing I'd like to mention about Trump, though. You mentioned, because I mentioned in my previous lecture that if that's true, that WikiLeaks influenced the outcome, that means that someone has selected Trump. And what we're going to suggest in today's programme is that Assange is possibly an intelligence asset, which would mean that intelligence wanted Trump elected. And one thing that has come to light for me is that I think they can get rid of Trump whenever they want to. If you just look at his history and how much information they've probably got on him, they could release information to get rid of him. But he does champion a couple of very important issues that I think are correct. One of which is the autism issue, vaccinations being involved in the cause of autism, and the other one is the global warming con.
Yes.
Or the climate change con. He's made comments which support those. So my comment is, when he does go down the plug hole, and who knows when that will be, but I think he will go down the plug hole in a big way, probably worse than Nixon did, right?
Yes.
I think the intention is to take those issues with him, and maybe a whole load of other stuff that they want to bury.
And they've also built up a very big kind of body of people that can help get him flushed down, judging by all the marches and all this that we've seen. So if that choice is made at some point in the near future before the next election, then they'll get heavily into the flushing action and make it a very sort of big, and loud affair, probably.
Yeah. Heavily into the flushing action, absolutely. Now then, when I've researched WikiLeaks and Assange, I recommend this book that I've been looking at, Deconstructing WikiLeaks by Daniel Estulin. And Daniel Estulin has also uncovered the details of the Bilderbergers and their influence on world power. So I highly recommend this book. There's some fascinating insights. And I'm going to be reading quite a few quotes from this book as we go along in today's programme. But I thought I'd start off, Andrew, because I have commented on WikiLeaks before and my cynicism of WikiLeaks. So let's just have a look at this previous Richplanet clip just to set the scene. My attention was recently drawn to these statues, which were put up in Berlin in May this year. The statues pay homage to the three supposed whistleblowers, Julian Assange, Edward Snowden and Bradley Manning. Now, if you believe these chaps are real whistleblowers, then I suggest you go and do a bit more homework. Now, in the run-up to 9/11, CIA asset Osama bin Laden was on the CIA's most wanted list. This is because the public's minds were being prepared to accept who did 9/11 in advance of the event. As pointed out by Bill Cooper, a guy from CNN just waltzes into Osama bin Laden's cave and interviews him. The point being, if a news reporter knows where to find Osama bin Laden, how come he has not been caught by the CIA?
Supposedly, a CNN reporter found Osama bin Laden, took a television camera crew with him, went into Osama bin Laden's hideout, interviewed him and his top leadership, his top lieutenants and colonels and generals in their hideout. Now, don't you think that's kind of strange, folks? You see, because the largest intelligence apparatus in the world, with the biggest budget in the history of the world, has been looking for Osama bin Laden for years and years and years, and can't find him. Some doofus jerk-off reporter with a camera crew waltzes right into his hideout and interviews him. Now, that tells us two things. Either everyone in the intelligence community and all of the intelligence agencies of the United States government are blithering idiots and incompetent fools, including the entire apparatus of the FBI and all of their personnel, or they're lying to us. They're not looking for him at all.
This is very reminiscent to me of Ed Snowden's situation, who was supposedly living in temporary asylum in Russia to evade capture by the Americans, who supposedly want to arrest him for espionage charges. If you believe that, you really will believe anything. How is it possible for a British comedian to find Ed Snowden in Russia and interview him? Don't you think the CIA would have found him first, even if he is in Russia? Do you really think the Russian government is protecting Snowden? It is all theatre, and of course the Russians are compliant with the script. As Lenin once said, the best way to control the opposition is to lead it ourselves, and that is exactly what the CIA are doing with Assange and Snowden. They are not whistleblowers, they are actors. Julian Assange has actually stated that there was no conspiracy involved in 9/11. You heard that right, folks. No conspiracy with 9/11. If you ever visit Berlin, please make sure you take a dog with you so you can let it piss on these statues. They are a joke. Assange was even given a TV show on the disinformation news channel Russia Today, which is now a cesspit of half-truths and diversion, clearly being made by the West for the West. As far as I am aware, Assange is not wanted by the US government at all, but the media does everything to make you think he is in order to raise his profile, and also uses actors holding up CIA posters to fool people into thinking this is a real issue. Okay, so I'm drawing a parallel there with what Bill Cooper said about Osama bin Laden and about how, well, if the media can get close to him, why the hell can't intelligence agencies? So do you want to...
Yeah, absolutely. And I think later on we're going to discuss this interview, or the two interviews. I think you watched the same ones that I did. And the first one I watched was the one by John Pilger, which was done, I think, in November 2016. And I actually thought, the comment you made there about the Bill Cooper commentary on Osama bin Laden being interviewed, that was one of the thoughts that was, in my mind when I was watching this John Pilger interview, that he's in there in the Ecuadorian embassy doing this interview. It seemed to have some sort of vague parallels there.
All right, so we're going to go try and chart some of the life of Julian Assange, which isn't easy. Seems to be shrouded in mystery. A lot of his childhood and his adolescence and his working life. But let's go right back to his childhood. Apparently, he never knew his real father, and story is that when he was a young boy, aged just 8, his mother divorced, and she married another man, or became romantically involved with another man that they had a child with when Assange was 8 years old, and his name was Leif Mainel. But this guy was a musician, and he was also connected to or part of a cult called The Family. Now, there's actually a film being made all about this cult, operating in the Melbourne area of Australia, I believe, run by this woman called Anne Hamilton Byrne, who I think died fairly recently.
Yes.
And Anne Hamilton Byrne, this sort of blonde-haired, attractive woman in the 1960s, she set up this cult which acquired over 500 disciples, and she was controlling all of these other people's children, basically. Do you want to make an observation on it, Anna, before
Yeah, I mean,
we'll show a clip on it?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll show the clip, and I'd heard about this before. We proposed this program, or you proposed this program, and I heard about this alleged cult connection with Assange, but I didn't know the details. Just to add something I picked up from a Guardian article, that Assange's parents ran a touring theatre company, and he went to 37 different schools, according to this article from The Guardian. So yeah, very unusual sort of background. And as we're going to come on to, these cults seem to have certain traits that basically, involve a form of mind control, because that's essentially what the cult is. This way of forcing people to think in a certain way and behave in a certain way because of abuse or threats of violence, or etc. Deprivation. And this one was pretty extreme, wasn't it? This particular cult.
Now calls for compensation for the children of notorious cult The Family, whose childhood was marred by daily abuse. Tonight, its former guru lies on her deathbed. Despite the efforts of police, she was never held accountable for the pain she inflicted on the children of the sinister sect.
I love children.
It was eerie. This was where some of the worst crimes were committed, allegedly, against the children.
No kid should ever have to put up with what we did.
This is the moment of rebirth upon a new planet.
Allegations of child theft at birth, the administration of a drug, LSD, to children. You start to think, I can't walk away from this.
She is a sociopathic monster.
They called themselves The Family, but this was no ordinary family.
We weren't allowed to be children. We were designed kids.
Their motto, unseen, unheard, unknown. But this bizarre cult is now world-renowned, as more details of what went on inside it are uncovered.
Everything was taken away from us children. Everything you can think of.
Tonight we'll show you the never-before-seen police interviews.
Did you want to speak to your solicitor again? Or try to ring him again?
You'll hear from the dogged detective who wants to see change.
But was justice totally done? No.
And there's calls for Australia's lost children, now adults, to get the proceeds from this cult leader's estate, reportedly worth up to $10 million.
I think the people who have been damaged should be compensated. They're doing it tough.
No, that's really beautiful, that, honey.
Anne Hamilton Byrne looked like an enchanting movie star, charismatic and beautiful. But that smile masked what's been described as evil incarnate.
In my time in policing, she is the most evil person I've ever known.
Here in Melbourne's Lake Eildon, up to 28 children were collected by Anne in a sick bid to create a kind of master race. Some of her 500 disciples helped convince mothers to adopt them out. They thought the kids were going to a good home. The reality was far from it.
We didn't have identities. We didn't have our correct names, our correct ages.
The children raised in this house of horrors were made to look picture perfect, donning neat little uniforms and matching hairstyles.
That was so that Anne could adopt more people into her cult, get more followers.
Anne Hamilton-Byrne is now a frail 96-year-old in palliative care. As her life comes to an end, former sect members are asking what will happen to her massive fortune.
We didn't have everything that we needed. We had most things.
There's quite a lot of money in her estate, and I believe it's time that this case was reopened and that the money that's left in her estate should be distributed to the people that she harmed in the course of establishing this cult.
Anne wanted to look like she was an incredible mother with this number of children, well-dressed, well-behaved. Propaganda is all it was for.
Anna Ray Trina Byrne, who grew up in the sect, knows that behind the Von Trapp family facade was a fearful existence.
We were a team of children trying to live without kind people.
Adam Lanchester, another of the cult children, punished on a daily basis.
Beltings, no food. Auntie Anne and my mum Elizabeth Whittaker held my hands and burnt it with a cigarette lighter in front of all the other kids.
Living in Lake Eildon, what was that like for you?
Hell. Hell on earth.
Anne would recruit mostly suburban housewives and some of society's highest flyers.
Doctors, we're talking nurses, we're talking barristers, solicitors. There were so many bizarre stories about who she was. We had to drill down and get the facts.
A new documentary called The Family, filmed over 3 years, is revealing new case details. Director Rosie Jones.
It's a story about family, about love, betrayal, loyalty.
I was in the sect 1971 until September 1985.
The film includes police interviews with the children shortly after they escaped, as well as cult members.
Dan came across and said to me, it's time that you got married and had a child.
How long after you've been initiated was this?
Only for a couple of days.
So this is basically about 10 days after you after you first met up.
Yeah, I didn't have time to think.
I had been taught that police and other outsiders would hurt us, and that men would want to rape us.
This is Leanne Crease today.
We didn't have a childhood, so we were abused every day. I don't call that childhood.
She spent 16 long years living under Anne's reign and was the first to escape.
I was given LSD when I was 14. It was a form of what in the sect as a whole was called going through. It was when we became supposedly initiated into the inner sanctum.
I believed in them and something had to be done. Anne had to be stopped.
Former police officer Lex DeMann headed Operation Forest, the task force commissioned to investigate the family. He says the drug LSD was an essential ingredient for this cult.
And when they were administered the LSD at night and the room was dark, Anne would appear at the doorway with a bright light behind her, with, would you believe, dry ice in a bucket behind her. And so through the hallucinatory process, they would wake up and they would believe they have seen Jesus Christ.
In the late 80s, police raided the compound and rescued the children. Anne and her husband Bill fled Australia.
Mari Moore from Channel 9. The community was absolutely shocked. They couldn't believe that those children had been locked away and treated like they were, and nobody noticed.
Former current affair journalist Mari Moore hunted them down in Hawaii.
Can you explain to me why you treated the children like you did? And Bill, if you'd like to give explanations as to your involvement in why the children were locked away.
Nothing to say to you.
But I think in her delusional way, she really thought she could convince people that she was fine, that she was a good woman.
Eventually, police had the family leader extradited for her day in court, but she was only fined a measly $5,000.
We've got to be very conscious and on our guard always to make sure that this type of behaviour is never allowed to occur again.
We are doing well under the circumstances, but I will argue that we are all struggling.
And those scars do live within you forever.
I'm in awe of the resilience that they've shown through what they've gone through.
Hello, how are you?
Recently, a huge moment for Adam as he reconnected for the first time with his blood relatives.
They're my everything at the moment. Slowly, we're really bonding as a family, as a family should be.
That documentary, The Family, screens in select theatres from tomorrow.
And Anne Hamilton Byrne used LSD as well on her subjects and would deprive them of light, and similar to the isolation tanks used in MK Ultra programs.
And she had a particular predilection for certain types of children, didn't she? That's also what I didn't, and that's why, you know, because people say, no, this sounds cult story, it could be just a made up rumour, you know, we don't know for sure, but there's a few things, isn't there?
I think the contention is how closely Assange was linked to the cult. Let me just come on to that then. So this woman would, if the child didn't already have blonde hair, they would have their hair dyed blonde and cut in a certain way so they all look the same. And she was running this cult from the 1960s right up to the late 1980s. Now, there's been a documentary which has come out which exposes all of the crimes of this cult. So that is a long time to be running such an organisation without actually being arrested or whatever. So that then brings the question, well, was she being supported? Because she'd never been prosecuted or brought to justice for her supposed crimes. And the other thing is that information that came out of the investigation was made top secret. So we have to ask, was there an intelligence agency involved in assisting? And also I believe that certain people involved in psychiatry were involved in the cult as well. So was it a covert intelligence operation probably being run by the CIA or some other organisation?
This is the sort of thing, and particularly in that news clip that we reviewed earlier on, they were actually talking about where these children came from, the children that went into the cult, and they mentioned that they were like, you know, quite wealthy people, doctors, they mentioned nurses, and they're not known for being wealthy, but in other words, if some of the children were drawn from elite families, then that, you know, ties into some of the other people, like, you know, these pop stars that have, you know, like Lady Gaga, and quite a lot of them have come children from wealthy backgrounds and so forth. So you've got similar, you know, things happening in the basis of how those cults are being populated.
Now let's just come on to the contention as to whether Assange was closely involved in this cult. So his stepfather, who was definitely involved in the cult, came on the scene when he was 8 years old. Now when he was 11 years old, Assange's mother fell out with her partner and then wanted to flee the family home, and she was worried that the father was going to get custody. So the claim is that they were on the run from this guy when Assange was between the ages of 11 and 16. They're trying to get away from this guy because they didn't like what he was doing and what have you, right? So for 3 years, presumably, he was on the scene between Assange at the ages of 8 and 11. Now, both of us, when we watched this clip, we're watching these little blonde children with tracksuits on, all dressed the same. We both picked out a person we thought, is that Assange?
Right, yeah, there's one particular child, I don't know if we'll put the clip in here, but it's from an Australian news broadcast review of this new film, isn't it? The Family, it's about 8 minutes long. And yeah, there's one child that particularly runs towards the camera, and you know, we were discussing and looking at the clip, it's probably going to be sort of early 80s, mid 80s. Assange was born in 74, so that would put it in the right time frame potentially we didn't check the date of the clip, but it is very peculiar. I know we're kind of just sort of speculating here, but we both had the same thought at the same time, didn't we?
Yeah, and let's just say that Assange was an absolute member of the cult from the age of 8 up to 16. Let's just say that was the case, that he was part of this cult, right? You've got to account for where he was when he wasn't in the cult. So a great cover story would be, he travelled around and he went to 37 different schools. So that means you're never going to find a friend or a colleague who can say, yeah, I was sitting next to him at school, because there's so many of them.
Yeah.
So is it the case that he was part of this cult right the way up until his sort of mid-teens? And they weren't really on the run.
Yeah.
So who knows? Now, if we can just mention perhaps at this point a little bit about Assange's character and his mannerisms.
Yeah, he's kind of, he doesn't express much emotion, and he's very sort of curt with his responses. And this Guardian article, which I read from 2010, makes that sort of comment that, I think that there's a comment made in this Guardian article that when you're with Julian Assange, having dead air is not, he doesn't worry about there being dead air. In other words, he's not very forthcoming with his conversation.
Yeah, his social intercourse is a bit abnormal.
Yes.
And is that a result of being part of a cult or involved in a mind control program? All right, and the other thing about, let's say it was the CIA that were backing that cult, or using it as a research project or whatever, using Australia as a foreign nation, that gives them another layer of deniability. And also having the cutout of Anne Hamilton Byrne, she provides the deniability for an intelligence agency running that. And that would explain why she's never been prosecuted.
Right.
All right.
And there was one other clip that caught my attention again, speculation. But they showed this clip of them stood at the reporter stood outside the Freemasons hospital.
Yeah. So Anne Hamilton Byrne, in her old age, she lived to a very old age, has been nursed in a Freemason hospital.
But then again, I have to point out that she was, I think, quite a wealthy woman, wasn't she? And they talked about having a lot of money in her estate when she died and this sort of thing. So,
Another thing I read was that he lived for a time on an island called Magnetic Island off the coast in Queensland.
Yes. Yeah.
Not sure if that's of any significance.
Very strange.
So if we go forward in time a bit to his, his late teens, let's say, Assange was born in 1974. And according to Wikipedia, and just to reiterate, I don't read from Wikipedia because it represents truth. I read from Wikipedia because that's what they're trying to get people to believe. There may be some truth in what I'm about to read. So according to Wikipedia, he started hacking in 1987 under the name of Mendax. So his first sort of work experience, if you like, is in computer hacking. Not that that's actual work. So in 87 he would be 74, only 13, right? He and two others known as Trax and Prime Suspect formed a hacking group they called the International Subversives. During this time he hacked into the Pentagon and other US defense facilities allegedly, Milnet, US Navy, blah blah blah, right? And so why didn't he get an extradition request like Gary McKinnon? You have to wonder that, don't you?
Right.
So in 1991, Assange was discovered hacking into the Melbourne Master Terminal of Nortel, a Canadian multinational telecommunications corporation. The Australian Federal Police tapped Assange's phone line while he was using a modem. So in 1991, he's still going to be in his teens, probably 17, I think, something like that. Raided his home at the end of October and eventually charged him in 1994, so it took 3 years for them to bring charges, with 31 counts of hacking and related crimes. So that's from quite a young sort of mid-teens up to his, he's probably in his early 20s by the time he gets prosecuted. In December 1996, he pleaded guilty to 25 charges. The other 6 were dropped. He was ordered to pay reparations of Australian dollars 2,100 and released on a good behaviour bond, avoiding a heavier penalty resulting from the perceived absence of malicious or mercenary intent and his disrupted childhood. So the court acknowledged, according to this, that he had a disrupted childhood. Now, if we move forward from then, is sort of very early computer hacking days, which seems quite extensive according to that sounds to me like he was a real nuisance and not really trying to use computer hacking for any kind of good reason other than to cause mischief. From 1993 onwards, there's various things you can see on Wikipedia where he's written some open source software, or he's done a patch for this thing or that. But from 1993 up to, let's say, 99, it doesn't appear, there's no company you can pin down that he's working for through his career. He's also been involved in software piracy, allegedly.
Right.
So we were talking about open source, and he's claimed, or I've read that he has claimed that his code is in all Apple products, right? But I'm not aware that Apple actually acknowledged this. So just tell us about open source software and how, because you know obviously a lot about software, how open source software is developed and what that means.
Well, generally, the way that it's worked is that these days people can download the Linux operating system, which is a viable, perfectly usable operating system, which is free. It's an alternative to Windows and Mac OS. And the idea was that when that started in the early 90s with Linus Torvalds, you could then, he decided that he would write a new operating system. So he wrote some programs which were the sort of core modules of the operating system, and then he put them on the internet and said, here's my first version. Anybody that wants to improve my programs or add new programs to this collection along, with the same sort of themes to help expand the functions of the operating system can do that. Mm-hmm. So open source is where you publish the source code for your program, which can be C or assembly language or any programming language basically, and then other people, for example, develop a utility, a disk utility or a graphics utility, and then somebody else might come on and add new features to that source code. And the reason that they can do that is that the source code is all public, it's open, in other words, open source. Anybody can add to it, improve the program, add new features. And so allegedly we're told Assange was doing that as he probably taught himself how to program, and he was then doing that with code which may have ended up as part of Apple's operating system, perhaps, we don't know.
Well, I don't think Apple develops their code through open source.
No.
Right?
No.
So I don't see how he could have written for Apple unless he was working for Apple, right? One of the systems that I've used, OS Commerce, which is an open source system, it's incredible how software actually still works when it's developed in an open source way. It has to be made very, very modular so that if a bug does get in there, it can, that module can be dropped or replaced or what have you.
Right.
But anyway, we'll start talking about software now.
Yes.
But the point being that, for example, if I go through my career, I can tell you the names of the company that I worked for between which years. There doesn't appear to have that sort of traceability on Assange's CV.
And I mean, when an employer sees a gap on your CV or your resume, as they call it in the US, they'll home in on that. They'll want to know what you were doing in that gap.
Yeah, well, one gap appears to be, and viewers can correct me if they can fill it in or inform me if they can fill it in, between 1999, when he claims that he registered a domain name called leaks.org. So supposedly, and I don't know if this is true because I've checked the domain registration and it doesn't have his name on it that I could see. He was interested in leaks in 99. That's the official story. I'm not saying I believe that. In 2006, so between 1999 and 2006, or the end of 2006, when WikiLeaks was set up, what was he doing in that time? I don't know. If we just look at another thing in his past, in 1994, and it's in this book by Daniel Esterlin, there's actually an email that Assange wrote to a NASA employee called Fred Blonder, and it was also copied in to somebody at Los Alamos Laboratories. And at the time of Assange's email, Fred Blonder was working on a cybersecurity program called the NASA Automated Systems Incident Response Capability. So it looks as though Assange was assisting in some way, whether that be in an open source way. I can't imagine it was in a true open source fashion if he's working for NASA and Los Alamos Labs, but he was in the, I mean, I'll not read it out, it's a bit geekish, the email.
Yes, yeah.
But it's to do with cybersecurity or program security, right?
Okay.
So now there's another person, let's just read this, called Peter Zatko. Now Peter Zatko started working for DARPA, I think, in 2010. So DARPA is the Defense
Advanced Research Projects Association,
who were involved in a very early version of the internet.
That's right. So
they developed computer and other cyber-related technologies to do with connected to defense. So I'm just going to read this out. So there's a computer club in Germany called the Chaos Computer Club, which would have conferences. I was in Germany for Chaos Congress in 2009, a hacker conference. And after attending a series of talks, I was headed back to my hotel when I spotted Julian Assange. This predated my working as a project manager at DARPA, as a hacker in residence, if you will. So he was employed by DARPA because he was a hacker the following year after he's at this computer conference, this guy, Peter Zatko. It was also before WikiLeaks released the video Collateral Murder, which we'll come on to, and hundreds of thousands of diplomatic cables, the Swedish rape allegations, and Julian ending up a virtual prisoner holed up in Ecuador's diplomatic mission. So in other words, what he's saying is, Julian Assange was kind of okay when I spoke to him at this point, yeah? So he's trying to, what he's insinuating there is, I would never have spoken to him if I'd known he was going to do all that. So given that I hadn't seen Julian in more than a decade, so he knew Julian Assange in 1999, I greeted him and we agreed to grab some dinner and a catch-up. After reminiscing about the old gang, he and I had been part of the same hacker milieu, as Julian would say. I asked why he had skipped out on the hacking scene to form WikiLeaks. Last I heard, Julian had left to study mathematics and physics at the University of Melbourne. He was working on a duress-based crypto file system, also known as the rubber hose file system. So that would be, I think, in 1997.
Okay.
Right? So he's gone. If he has gone to Melbourne University to study mathematics and physics, then he's gone there a little bit late. Because if he was born in 1974, 84, 94...
He was going to be 25 in 99, so it's a mature student getting to...
Julian told me his graduate work had been funded by a US government grant, specifically NSA and DARPA money, which was supposed to be used for fundamental security research. It was a time when the Bush administration and Department of Defense were seen to be classifying a great deal of fundamental research and pulling back on university funds. So it's possibly got links to the NSA at that point. From 99 onwards up to 2006, I can't see what he was doing.
Right.
But he's had possible ties to NASA, Los Alamos, and the NSA in the mid to late 90s. So here you have a non-US citizen at a foreign university doing graduate work studies, and the United States government came barreling in and not only snuffed out the funding and killed his studies, it also barred him from knowing what it was he had been funded to research. So you see, depending on who you ask, the US government actually helped create WikiLeaks, and the rest, as they say, is history. So, yeah.
Some very dodgy connections there, by the sounds of it. If that seems to fit with everything else we're going to discuss at some level fairly closely.
Okay. So we come now to the launch of WikiLeaks, which was in December 2006. And something which really raises alarm bells for me is that the Washington Post and Time magazine, they wrote articles about WikiLeaks, so promoting WikiLeaks effectively, telling us what was to come. Before any significant leaks had come out, they're bigging up this organisation in the mainstream press. Now, if you're a new media organisation, which is what WikiLeaks are, online newspaper or whatever it might be, normally you would have to build up a customer base by spending money on advertising or promotion in some way or other. So do you want to just comment on that, Andrew?
Well, absolutely. I mean, you quite rightly made the analogy with an organisation perhaps like UK Column or Richplanet itself, in that you need to make people aware of what you are doing. So you have to have a way of doing that, and one way is to start a regular update service. And maybe then Facebook wasn't as prominent as it is now and everything, but you could still. I think Google AdWords was sort of in operation by that sort of time. But anyway, however you do it, you're going to need to build up a regular updates and maybe have an RSS feed on your site so that you can feed updates to that and people can subscribe to that feed and get the updates. But
unless you've got the mainstream media doing it for you.
Unless you've got the mainstream media doing it for you, which, as you rightly pointed out, seemed to be the way that WikiLeaks immediately started to operate.
Right. So before they've even gained any sort of reputation or credibility whatsoever, they're bigging up WikiLeaks, right? And by March, but after that point, by March 2007, they'd allegedly leaked 1 million documents within 3 months of starting. So.
And that's a lot of documents.
Yeah. So, but how did anyone know about WikiLeaks to give them the million documents?
Yeah. In other words, where did those 1 million documents come from? That's who has access to 1 million documents to leak.
And we are going to come on to people who've commented on that, such as John Young, in a moment.
Right.
So throughout the WikiLeaks life, as we've said, it's had help from mainstream media. And the main publications have been the New York Times in the US, The Guardian in the UK, and Der Spiegel in America, and also The Economist. I mean, these are just establishment arse-licking organisations that are not, they're not guardians of truth. They're architects of disinformation.
Right, and I mean, I didn't really investigate WikiLeaks much at all. I had no interest in it and I think it was primarily because we're going to talk about Julian Assange's comment about 9/11, aren't we? And by the time that WikiLeaks came out, I already knew about 9/11, and therefore, to me, the WikiLeaks should be leaking information about 9/11, but it never has. But what was interesting was, I think in a previous conversation I had with you, or in similar conversations I had with other people, I felt that what they were doing with WikiLeaks, and it was essentially a psychological operation, and I felt that it was changing the way that they were going to get people to perceive the news and where the news stories came from. In other words, it was going to come out of a secretive organisation where you couldn't really get the name of the person that gave you the story because, and interestingly, you mentioned The Guardian a minute ago. When I was reading up, when we'd agreed to do this discussion, I found an article from 2010 from the Guardian, and it actually says at the top, and I never read this before a few days ago, Julian Assange, the whistleblower, Julian Assange, founder of WikiLeaks, may just represent the future of news reporting, but he's not a journalist. So that was exactly what I thought. In other words, The Guardian seemed to be admitting to me, as I read it, that WikiLeaks was a psychological operation.
So they know that they're losing out in print media and TV media. People are getting more and more information from the internet. So someone is going to define how that's going to work.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So you mentioned 9/11. So let's give the Julian Assange's quote on 9/11. So I'm just going to read it from this book. So the Belfast Telegraph interviewed Julian Assange on July the 19th. I'm not sure what year that was, but he stated, "Anytime people with power plan in secret, they are conducting a conspiracy." So there are conspiracies everywhere. There are also crazed conspiracy theories. It's important not to confuse these two. So the interviewer then asks him, what about 9/11? "I'm constantly annoyed that people are distracted by false conspiracies, such as 9/11, when all around we provide evidence of real conspiracies for war or mass financial fraud? Very non-specific.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What about the Bilderberg conference, the interviewer asks? That is vaguely conspiratorial in a networking sense, Assange claims. We have published their meeting notes, and as have other people published their meeting notes. So, yeah, to suggest that there was no conspiracy involved in 9/11, what planet is he living on?
Right.
And who is he really working for?
Right. I mean, if he, you know, he is clearly an intelligent person, despite whatever background he may have had. If you listen to the interviews, he's quite articulate, and he does, you know, he does understand how politics operates, and he even, you know, he even more or less says that the two-party system in the US is a joke. He doesn't put it in those terms, but if you listen to the whole interviews, he knows that is a, you know, is just another puppet show, really, you know. So why doesn't he, you know, go the whole hog, so to speak?
Mm-hmm. I mean, you mentioned there about him being politically aware. You read in some of his emails where he talks about the importance of language and using certain words and certain phraseology in order to influence lots of people. So he'll say, well, we don't use the word hacking, we put the word ethical before it, so, or ethical leaking. Leaking can have a negative connotation. Ethical leaking changes it. So Dr. Judy Wood has spoken about this in very careful use of language. And as you say, when he's interviewed, he's never in a hurry or pressed for an answer, and he always considers his words just like a politician. So how did he become so proficient, sounding like a politician with this computer hacking background?
14 pages. About this topic, also concurrently in the Spiegel, 17 pages, the New York Times, I'm not sure how many, International Herald Tribune, and I believe the Telegraph also has it on the front page, and I haven't checked into the others.
What do you say when people like the White House accuse you of compromising the security of troops in Afghanistan by virtue of this massive leak?
Yeah. We're familiar with groups whose abuse we expose, attempting to criticize the messenger to distract from the power of the message. And we don't see any difference in the White House's response to this case to the other groups that we have exposed.
Can you then therefore answer the question that's been asked twice already by journalists? You mentioned the word crimes. Can you please just be a bit more specific about what you meant by are these crimes committed within these documents? Because unless the question's answered, how do you expect the media to take you seriously down the line when there are potentially more good stories to come out?
What is your specific question?
You mentioned a while ago war crimes or crimes when you were talking about the documents. You weren't specific. What I'm asking you is to be more specific when you talk about war crimes, or crimes, as I think the word you used.
I think I was speaking about the issue in general. However, it is up to a court to decide clearly whether something is in the end a crime. That said, prima facie, there does appear to be evidence of war crimes in this material. An example is the Task Force 373 HIMARS missile strike on a house which killed 7 children.
You find an average computer hacker, right? They don't speak like that. They're not so well trained in this art of political speaking.
Political discourse,
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So where's he been trained on that? And
it's a
to
good
be able
question.
to hold his own in these, not that he's actually ever taken part in a proper critical interview. We'll mention the interviews he has taken part in. And I've just made a few notes here from something that I was listening to on the internet, that the leaks on the whole have not damaged the imperialist agenda that the US is running in their war campaigns. Right. But it has helped to, let's say, discredit Iran or reveal alleged Iran's nuclear program. There's been nothing on any sort of Israeli nuclear program or crimes. It's helped destabilize Pakistan. And one of the things that the leaks have done is okay, it's revealed certain groups in Pakistan and Afghanistan as operating terrorist groups, but it's not found any link to US intelligence agencies, or the fact that US intelligence agencies are controlling, let's say, the Pakistani intelligence agency and this kind of thing. So it's very one-sided disclosures.
It is, and in fact, you know, we're going to talk about the John Pilger interview, but that actually comes out in the Pilger interview. That's one of the notes that I made when I was listening to that Assange basically blames the formation of those, you know, ISIL and ISIS groups on the Saudis. That's essentially what he does in that interview. So it's not really any different from what the US State Department itself has essentially been trying to do. You know, you made this point, and it's horrible to kind of think about, but I think it is worth mentioning. The video which really put WikiLeaks right at the forefront of everybody's minds was this where people were killed by this helicopter gunship shooting and missile attack, wasn't it? And you know, and you made this point about the way that's like having the horrible sort of head on a pole type thing, and I think it's worth you mentioning that.
Yeah, I'll just mention that. It was an analogy that I drew.
Yeah.
WikiLeaks released these videos. I'm not sure if they came through Bradley Manning. I think they may have done.
Yes, I think they did come through him, didn't they? Yes.
Where you've got you can hear the voice of the helicopter pilot, and there's a whole load of people on the ground, and they're defenseless, and they're basically mowed down. They're just killed in total cold blood. It's sick. It's just sick. And WikiLeaks leaks this. But if it hadn't been leaked by WikiLeaks, then mainstream media, has it been shown on mainstream media? I think it has.
I think it has, but
that gave them license to show it, because they weren't releasing it. They were just commenting on the fact that WikiLeaks have released it. So it's okay to now show this. And I made the analogy of, well, we've got an empire, the US empire, stroke Israeli empire. We've had empires in the past of total dictatorships where if someone steps out of line, you will get your head chopped off. Not only that, we'll stick it on a pole so everyone can see your head so that no one else acts in this way. Right? So it's using fear.
Yeah.
Does releasing those videos particularly damage the US agenda? Because it not necessarily.
No. I mean, it's showing that they can act with impunity, and any nation that wants to go up against them can expect that sort of treatment, you know, where they'll just go in and kill civilians, unarmed civilians, with impunity.
Yeah. It shows that international law doesn't apply to them.
Right.
So that's quite a scary thought.
Yeah.
And so is it really being released for this sort of open freedom of information reasons in order to prevent war? Because as far as I'm aware, I'm not sure how much Assange speaks about being anti-war. We need to stop all wars, like Nick Colostrom
does. That's right. I've
not heard him speak in those terms.
No, you know, and we hear of many stories of atrocities, you know, from people that have come back from war zones. But this was an actual time when it was actually blasted across the screens for everyone to see, an atrocity. So the way that then the global population perceives those atrocities has been altered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's take an example of a real whistleblower, Mordechai Vanunu, who found out about Israel's secret nuclear program, and he ended up in prison for 18 years, and most of you probably never heard about him. That's what happens to real whistleblowers. Right? You don't end up on the front page of the Sun, the Times, and the Guardian simultaneously.
Yeah.
Because those who orchestrate cover-ups in the intelligence, they've got all their tentacles in the mainstream media.
And of course, going back to that video, Bradley Manning was prosecuted, wasn't he? I can't remember what happened to him. But then again, so if we're starting to shift the view of what WikiLeaks actually is from what the mainstream says to what we think it is. It's a way of presenting information to the public which is different to mainstream media.
It appears that it's possibly globalists that are behind the setting up of it and the sponsoring of it. Perhaps we can mention John Young, who 10 years before WikiLeaks was set up, was running a site called cryptome.org, which itself was leaking documents. Is that right, Andrew?
That's right, yes, it was indeed. And I came across quite a few links to this because, and this is where we sort of start to get a little bit into the Iceland connection. There was an initiative to try and set up a haven in Iceland. And I think John Young, who runs cryptome.org, which to me, when I looked at it, is kind of a more honest version of WikiLeaks, because when you get onto this idea of funding, Assange was asking for like $250,000 or $500,000 funding, and John Young, who was running cryptome.org and was involved with Assange for a while, he says, "Well, hang on, why are you needing this sort of money? We don't need that sort of money to run a web server. You know, if you've got $10,000 a year, you can run a pretty decent web service for that. You know, with quite a lot of security and so forth." So, and there was quite a lot of discussion at that time, because I know that this Icelandic MP, Birgitta Jónsdóttir, she was involved with trying to get Assange and WikiLeaks a base in Iceland, and I think she came under fire for that as well, and that all went a bit wrong. And you can read about that on cryptome.org. And I think some of that is in the data. It's mentioned a little bit in Esterlin's book, isn't it?
Mm.
So,
yeah. There's several quotes from John Young in this book, Deconstructing WikiLeaks. So John Young was actually invited at the start of WikiLeaks to be on the board. But very soon after, he claimed that WikiLeaks is a fraud and they're working for the enemy. And he's made, as you say, he's made comments about the funding. I'll read out perhaps a few more quotes. So this is what Young has said. Announcing a $5 million fundraising goal by July will kill this effort. It makes WikiLeaks appear to be a Wall Street scam. This amount could not be needed so soon except for suspect purposes. I'd say the same about the alleged 1.1 million documents ready for leaking. Right? So he's saying the fact that they've got so many documents straight away makes it look like a scam. Way too many to be believable without evidence. I don't believe the number. So far, one document of highly suspect provenance. And then he says here, well, it only came up in the topic of raising $5 million the first year. That was the first red flag that I heard about. I thought that they were actually a public interest group up until then. But as soon as I heard that, I knew that they were a criminal organisation. Right? So pretty strong claims there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And let me just mention a few other people who, because WikiLeaks, when it was set up, it did publish the board members, the people involved, the group involved. But apparently it doesn't now. The board members are kept secret, as are the finances kept secret.
Yeah, that was one of the things that in the emails. They wanted to get public accounts. You know, once they'd set this going, this was in 2010, and they couldn't get any published accounts. They couldn't get Assange. Apparently, they were accusing Assange of being a one-man band, you know, and they didn't. He wouldn't publish any accounts. He wouldn't tell him where the money had come from, where it was going to, etc. And that I think was why they ended up not actually getting a footing in Iceland, because the people there weren't happy that the organisation was transparent enough for them.
Right. I mentioned earlier, I'm just going to list a few of the characters involved in the board. I mentioned earlier that WikiLeaks was advised by the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, and the FH, which is the Freedom House, both which have got links to what you might call the New World Order, the Council on Foreign Relations and the CIA.
Yeah.
Now, one person who was on the advisory board of WikiLeaks was Philip Adams. Now, he held Australian governmental media administration posts, and he worked for News Corp, owned by Rupert Murdoch. Let me have a look. Who else? We've got Chinese dissidents and Tiananmen dissidents, but who had links to CIA, were on the board of WikiLeaks. One of them, Liu, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, Ziob, Chinese literary critic, writer, professor, and human rights activist who called for political reforms and the end of communism, single-party rule in China. So this is someone who wants to reform China, and this is things that I've heard in various emails that let's say, states that are considered rogue states are targets of WikiLeaks, or rogue regimes. So if you're going to release dirt on certain regimes, we've heard the word, what's the next stage that follows that? Regime change. So have they been set up to assist the CIA's global plan to regime change any government which they don't like by releasing dirt on those rogue regimes, including China? Another name that I'll just mention is Cass Sunstein, who was an advisor to the Obama administration. He wasn't on the board of WikiLeaks, but he mentioned WikiLeaks in a very early article that he wrote in February 2007, before there'd been any significant releases again. So whether he just plucked that out of the mainstream media, I don't know. Now, this guy has written about conspiracy theories and how their behaviours need to be managed by government and how conspiracy theorists need to have their parties infiltrated and all the rest of it. We need to infiltrate conspiracy groups, this guy has said. So he's mentioned WikiLeaks. We've got another guy called Ben Laurie, who is the former cybersecurity boss of Google, director of the Open Rights Group. Assange asked Laurie for help designing a system to protect leakers' anonymity. Are you really going to go to Google to set up your system? When we know that Google is absolute corporate player, and then the name of George Soros keeps popping up as well, a character who is connected to all of the different New World Order players. Now, another character involved you might want to look up is Daniel Domscheit-Berg, or Daniel Schmidt as he was called. He joined WikiLeaks a year after it was set up, but then left in 2010, and he's written a book about it, right, which I've downloaded and I started reading it. Computer nerds don't write the best books, right? I don't really want to know what Assange has got in his duffel bag, you know what I mean? So I got a bit bored of that. But he's an odd character to watch videos on and try and figure out, well, if WikiLeaks is a complete intel setup, then this guy who was invited to join Assange, they were kind of a double act for a little while. You can find a lecture that they've given, a joint lecture that they've given. That must mean that he'd have to be in the fold as well, I would have thought. So did he write his own book? You can find videos of him online. So you look at the characters involved, it doesn't fill you with confidence. It doesn't make you think this organisation is what it claims.
No.
All right. So let's now, let's come on to his sort of living situation, right? Because there's some comedy mileage in this. So let's first go to 2009. This is an article which states that Julian Assange was wined and dined at the US Embassy. To the United States, Julian Assange may be public enemy number one. Some American politicians have even called for his execution. Right, so this article's been written at the end of December 2010, but less than a year ago, in December 2009, the founder of WikiLeaks was officially entertained at the US Embassy cocktail party by one of the very diplomats whose secrets he would soon spill to the world. At the reception held at the US Ambassador's residence in Reykjavik, Iceland, Mr. Assange chatted with Sam Watson, the embassy's deputy chief of mission. Assange was already sitting on dozens of Mr. Watson's classified cables at the time of the December party, including embarrassing details about America's and Britain's role following the collapse of Iceland's banks, which were later published to widespread outrage in the local media. So there's also information, I think, that he's leaked on Sarah Palin. Sarah Palin has called for Assange to be hunted down. Right, so he's been invited to US embassies, right? And, okay, so this is December 2009. So at some point, I don't know the exact date, people can look it up, there was rape allegations from someone in Sweden. Well, not from them, I believe, I think it was from the police, but there's a rape supposed rape case from Sweden. So he was then in legal difficulties. And there's also some alleged ongoing possible prosecution or stroke investigation from some court in the US, right? So he's kind of in exile and was given a home in the UK by independent video news journalist Vaughan Smith, and his family welcomed Mr. Assange, who created the whistleblowing website, into their home at Ellingham Hall near Bungay between December 2010 and December 2011. So he's living in this posh mansion in East Anglia for a year. Now, it just so happens that Vaughan Smith, whose house he was living in, is the owner of the Frontline Club. Now, the Frontline Club is this sort of elitist media organisation where people in the media get together and talk about certain things. And who helped set that up? George Soros, right? So while he's living in this house, we'll come on to his Ecuadorian embassy residence in a minute after we've done this next bit. So he's been sort of given a free home by this really wealthy media guy who probably knows George Soros in East Anglia for a year.
So it's clear he's well in with the elite, because he's getting looked after by them.
Now, so while he's living in East Anglia, which is this place not far from Norwich, he actually takes part in an episode of The Simpsons. He's featured on The Simpsons, and it is his real voice. So I'm just going to show the clip of The Simpsons episode that featured Assange's real voice. Let's just take a look at this.
I miss our home, and I want to go back. It's not perfect here, but it is close to nature. And if you have an axe to grind, WikiLeaks is right over there. How you doing, Mr. Assange?
That's my personal information, and you have no right to know about it. Hey, but we're neighbours. Would you like to come over for a movie sometime?
Is it Iraqi journalists being murdered?
Don't be ridiculous. It's an Afghan wedding being bombed.
Well, I've got a really big secret for you. I'm not wearing any underwear.
You know, you should really get out less.
Right, okay. Do you want to give a quick comment on the actual content of that first, Andrew, before we go on to
well,
this?
we pointed out that he's not a very good actor, is he? So that's fairly obvious. But humour aside, I mean, there are some quite sinister overtones to it as well. And we could probably do a whole programme on the actual Simpsons itself as another type of psychological operation. That's a whole other story. But when you discussed that with me a while ago, but I think you've obviously got some more information which I think proves that the people behind The Simpsons must be very well connected to people in the elite and the intelligence community.
One thing is definite, Assange agreed to take part in that Simpsons programme, and it was his voice in that programme. So he approved of that joke, making a joke about bombing an Afghani wedding.
Yeah.
Right. So I actually happen to know where Assange recorded the voice, because you say, well, he's living in the UK, he doesn't go to America anymore. How's he got a walk on part in The Simpsons? This is how. So this came from a Richplanet viewer, and I'll read it all out. In the summer of 2007, 2 weeks before the financial crash was announced, I purchased the best known recording studio in Norwich, Purple Studios, in conjunction with a radio station that I was running. We recorded many artists, mostly local, but some more famous, such as the Manic Street Preachers. Yeah, Richie Edwards, he's still alive, by the way. In August of 2011, I received a phone call from an American woman who inquired about studio availability for the following week. She said that she was calling from Los Angeles and wanted to know if we could record an artist, but to record over ADSL to their studio in LA. We only had a basic broadband, and I explained that we had done similar things before over Skype, but recorded the files locally, and then we could send the file recording via digital means. She did not expand upon what the project was, but asked us to use discretion as this had to be kept secret. The following week came and went with no further contact. I thought it was a wind-up. But a few days later, she phoned again and apologised for not contacting us the previous week. Is the studio available for tomorrow night? She asked. I said yes. She gave me her details and her name was Bonnie Patila. She said that the producer of a TV show would call me at 6 p.m. the following day to go through what was required. She also requested that only myself and my sound engineer could be on site and that we were to keep quiet about the job as it was sensitive. This was very intriguing. What could it be? My sound engineer and I waited the following day, not knowing what was going on or who was going to walk through the door. At 6 p.m. the phone rang and an American man introduced himself as Al Jean, the producer of The Simpsons. He explained that we were to record a voiceover for one of the characters for the show, the 500th episode as it turned out, and that he, Al Jean, would direct him over Skype. We still did not know who the voiceover was, but it had become very exciting. At 7 p.m. a black car pulled up outside and a man came to the door. We confirmed that it was the correct location and the man had a quick look around, probably checking that it was just myself and the sound engineer. He then returned to the car and came back in with a woman and Julian Assange. We locked the doors behind everyone and prepared for the session. The woman turned out to be Assange's press agent, and she had the script that Julian Assange was going to read from. Al Jean spoke to the woman and Julian Assange over the phone, and I explained that Mr. Assange would be in the recording booth whilst we would all be in the control room. I spent the next hour on the phone to Al Jean, relaying his directions to the sound booth whilst we listened to Assange reading his script. Do that line again with a bit more gusto, and more emphasis on the "that's my personal information and they have no right to know about it," etc. So he was even directed for that really poor piece of acting. Can you believe it? Right. It was a very, very strange experience all round. Julian Assange was a very strange individual. He was even taller than me and he had a very strange aura about him, which actually made me feel a bit uneasy. He did not make any casual conversation. I wanted to ask him about WikiLeaks, as it was big news at the time due to the allegations of sexual harassment by Sweden, but I did not feel at all comfortable talking to him. I knew from the news that Assange was being held in house arrest in Suffolk, and the fact that he was in my building meant that I was in fact harbouring a wanted criminal. At the time, I believed that he was one of the FBI's most wanted men. Hence the secrecy. But obviously we know he's living in some mansion house, driving around in a car. He's clearly not a wanted man. If you do any search for Julian Assange, The Simpsons, it will say that the voiceover was recorded during house arrest at an undisclosed location near London. It was in fact in Norwich. Articles such as this one on Wikipedia and this one here also state that the producers of The Simpsons did not know the location and were only given a phone number to call, which is obviously untrue because they were the ones who reached out to us and booked the studio. So they're saying officially that they spoke to Assange on just some telephone number and they didn't know where he was, someone's driven him to the studio with his PR agent, and they've actually booked the studio.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a total setup, you know. I mean, top to bottom.
Yeah. So he's a handled entity.
Yes. Yeah. He's protected. He's managed. He has a press, officer or whatever how you press, secretary or however you describe.
So the fact that they have to make up a lie that we don't know where he was when we recorded that for The Simpsons. It was somewhere, it was some secret place, thus perpetuating the myth that he's a wanted man and he's kind of in hiding in house arrest or whatever.
And just by listening to the quality of the audio, you can tell it wasn't recorded on a phone. They don't have him speaking down a phone in the Simpsons episode. They have him at a campsite, don't they, or something? Is it in the scene?
Yeah, it just says it will say that the voiceover was recorded during house arrest at an undisclosed location near London. So it doesn't say what technology was used, but it's somewhere where they didn't know where it was, which is clearly a lie. The whole affair was recorded within 2 hours. They all left. I had been asked by Al Jean, Bonnie Patila, and the woman who accompanied Assange not to talk about what had happened, as they needed to keep the whole thing under wraps. When they had left, my sound engineer and I agreed that it probably wasn't a good idea to talk to anyone about it, as it could have implications for us with the US intelligence agencies. Plus, I was running my Big Brother website and a bit of paranoia kicked in. So this chap's actually into alternative subjects, and he's posted some of my videos on his website. The fact of the matter that he was under house arrest and was trying to be extradited to the US by the American government. I'm not sure if that's correct, mind, by the extradition request. We'll come on to that. Assange broke his house arrest and travelled to Norwich, to my recording studio, which kind of meant that we were complicit to the fact. Should we have informed the authorities? The people that organised it have covered their tracks so that there is no mention of the location and have stated that they had no idea and only had a phone number. We thought it best to follow suit and keep stum. They obviously had a better grasp of the gravity of the situation than myself. The 500th episode of The Simpsons aired in February 2012, by which time I had quietly leaked the story to a very few close friends. They also thought it was a good idea to keep the entire situation under my hat. To this day, only a handful of people know this story. So there it is. I don't know if this is of any use to you, but this is my story as it happened. It was a strange, secretive meeting, and it left me feeling uneasy. Julian Assange left me feeling uneasy. He was, as my old art college tutor would describe, as a strange cove. It was as though he was all-important and kind of looked through us. An almost non-human aura about him, which sounds ridiculous, but he left me feeling very strange and uneasy. So,
well, that again all adds up to him being managed, and if he was indeed in this cult, as we, have sort of alluded to, that aura may have come or may have been generated by the activities that the cult, indulged in.
Mm-hmm. And we've spoken about these rape allegations from Sweden. Let's just come on to that, because I think that is why he's under some sort of house arrest. And there's an ongoing allegation, he claims not made by the person who was allegedly raped, by the police. And they've sent a request to question him, which has never happened, right? So he's not allowed to leave the UK apparently, right? So this is the current situation as I understand it. You've got two supposed entities want him, which is the Swedish police for some rape allegation, and the US government, but when you hear the allegations that the US have made against him, they say that it's a US secret grand jury investigation and impending prosecution. They never say prosecution. It's an impending prosecution. So they're still investigating him, right? So this has been going on for years and years. They've never said, right, he's guilty, we're going to issue the extradition request. As far as I'm aware, there's no extradition request from the US. It's just this ongoing, impending prosecution and grand jury investigation. But the way that the legal situation is that the Ecuadorian embassy have given him asylum because of the US situation. So they're saying, well, we don't agree that he should be taken to the US and put on trial because he's actually doing a good thing by leaking these documents. So we are going to give him asylum in Ecuador. So really he should go to Ecuador. The reason why he's not gone to Ecuador is because the British government are saying, right, you can't leave the UK until you have been interviewed by the Swedish government or by the Swedish police, because you might escape that prosecution by leaving our country. So the Ecuador government say, well, okay, well, he'll live in the Ecuadorian embassy. So you've got this ridiculous situation which has gone on for 4 years, where he comes out onto his balcony and where is he? He's in the media capital of the world, London, where people have got access to him, and he's got a platform there. Right?
Absolutely, literally, yeah.
And
but also he says in the interview with Pilger that the Swedish government or the Swedish police have cleared him. They've said that they don't believe the allegations of rape anyway. So if he gets extradited to Sweden, he'll be immediately extradited from there to the US. That's what he says in the Pilger interview.
Yeah.
So again, it's all
well, he does say that that's the reason why he doesn't go to Sweden in order to be interviewed, is because he thinks the Swedish government would extradite him.
Right.
So why doesn't he think the UK government would extradite him?
That's it. So how
you've also got other possible links to Sweden with, he said that he's placed his servers in Sweden in the past because of he says that they have good laws on freedom of speech. So we've got these 4 players. We've got the UK, Sweden, the US and Ecuador. So the point I'm making is that I've said this in my lecture, that Ecuador have got very good relations with the United States. They're not some rogue state that would want to undermine the US by helping WikiLeaks leak their documents. They're an ally of the US. So I don't believe that they're doing this against the wishes of the US government. I believe they're doing it so that he's then got some legitimate place, platform, from which to speak to the London media.
And to present this illusion that he's under threat, you know, but he's not really.
No.
And you ask what other questions. I think he's been there for, 5 years or 7 years or something, isn't it?
I think it's approaching 5 years, I believe.
So who's paying who's paying for him to be there? Who's supporting him? Who's paying for his board and lodgings?
And that's the other thing we haven't come on to.
Right, and I think Pilger asks him in this interview. He asks him, where do you publish the documents from? Because there's this question: is he sat at a laptop in the Ecuadorian embassy, managing the website and receiving all these documents? Blah, blah, blah. And it's claimed in the Pilger interview that the Ecuadorian government have cut the internet link to the embassy, so that he can't use it, presumably. But then Assange has said something that doesn't really matter, because he says in this Pilger interview, we publish from France, Germany, Netherlands and a number of other countries. So that right there says there must be a group of them, there must be a team of them. So my question then is, okay, so it's not just Assange publishing these documents, it's got people helping him. So why aren't they, why haven't they been grabbed by the US government? Why aren't they under investigation if it's really such a problem? And how have they been able to set up this international network? I'd like to know more about that.
Yeah, and the other interview that people might want to watch is by Democracy Now! Amy Goodman, who went into the embassy. Now, I remember that programme. It used to be on Edge Media Television. And I watched it now and again, thinking that it was an alternative news programme, but it's absolutely not, because she doesn't ask him any of the right questions. So both the Pilger interview and the Democracy Now! Interview, I'll just read out what I've written here. What they're doing is, they're promoting what I call a classic phony bone of contention.
Yes.
Because their arguments that they're having, or the point that their discussion contains a probably flawed assumption. And that flawed assumption, which is the information which is being leaked, is it being leaked for leaking's sake, or is it not a psy-op, or an attempt to control the alternative media? So the contention assumes that WikiLeaks is what it purports to be, right? So they have this argument over, is it ethically right what you are doing, or should you be stopped from leaking documents? That's the argument that they have in these. Well, is John Pilger mainstream? I don't know what he is, right? But why hasn't he asked Assange about his childhood? Why hasn't he got to the bottom of the funding?
Yes.
Why isn't he asking all the questions that we are asking in this interview?
Exactly.
Right? Why is he just taking as read that WikiLeaks is what it purports to be, and then helping big up WikiLeaks' name in the world by having that argument, oh, well, by leaking that, you're putting people's lives at risk, Julian, you are a threat, or are you really for getting the truth out?
That's it. And I mean, most of the Pilger interviews centres around what we were discussing earlier about how WikiLeaks is influencing the US election. That's essentially the theme which runs through the Pilger interview. And as I said earlier, he even backs up this idea that the Saudis are funding ISIS and ISIL terrorism through the Clinton Foundation. That's mentioned. And so it's pretty much mainstream stuff. You know, it's not really going outside any of this territory really that they're normally in. It's just that Julian Assange is sort of being looked at as something which sits in between the political parties and is essentially compromising the operation of both those political parties. You know, in the US particularly.
One of the things that he says in the Amy Goodman interview is that he hasn't had any light for years in the Ecuadorian embassy. He's in a room without any daylight. What is the Ecuadorian embassy not got windows? Huh? Well, he can't sit near a window.
Oh, exactly.
It's just bollocks.
Yeah,
it is bollocks.
Yeah. And the other thing which he mentions in the Amy Goodman interview, I think there may be more than one Amy Goodman interview actually, because the one that I watched, she's not at the embassy. He's been interviewed over Skype, so she's not actually there. But he mentions in that interview again, another of the little things that tweaked me was he talks about Naomi Klein and how Naomi Klein is talking about climate change, but the climate change is an important issue. Again, he doesn't say that climate change is another scam. You know, and he could just say that if that's, he should know that. He should know, if he's an intelligent person, he looked at the evidence, he should know that the climate change issue is another scam which is being used to control people, but he doesn't say that. So again, he's promoting mainstream views.
Another thing that he states in the Amy Goodman interview is that that the UK police are surveilling him, obviously because they don't want him to leave the country because of the Swedish thing, supposedly. And that is costing the UK police £15,000 per day to surveil the Ecuadorian embassy.
Yeah.
So how would he know that?
Yeah.
Why would they tell anyone
Right,
that?
that's right, yeah.
Now, another person who has championed WikiLeaks is Annie Michon, who's the former MI5, the former handler of David Shayler. Sorry, the former girlfriend of, did I say handler? Sorry,
I think you did, yes.
The former girlfriend of David Shayler. Yeah, she who used to work for MI5. Used to. Doesn't work for them now, apparently.
No, I don't think she does.
No, not anymore. Not
anymore, I don't
But she
think.
champions WikiLeaks.
Apparently she does, yes.
Yeah, and I think she was there at the statue of Assange in Germany. Oh, Julian, we've got a statue of you now.
Wow. Well, that's pretty good. Maybe she was hoping they'd make one of her. Who knows?
Hope not. Okay, so shall we come on to the funding?
Why not?
Okay, which is another red flag. Assange has claimed that Visa, MasterCard and PayPal have all blocked payments to his organisation. Right? So how does he still get funding? Now, this guy we mentioned earlier, John Young, has made comments about the funding, and there's a quote on page, there's a few quotes in Daniel Aston's book. Let's just read a few quotes.
And as again, people can go to the Cryptome website and get more of these because there's a fair breakdown there.
The linchpin of WikiLeaks' financial network is Germany's Wow Holland Foundation. Mr. Assange said WikiLeaks gets about half its money from modest donations processed by its website, and the other half from personal contacts, including people with some millions who approach us. But that's not their only source of funding, according to email exchanges. Acquiring covert funding from intelligence agencies was also contemplated. Right, so they contemplated getting funding from intelligence agencies. Let me just read this other one on page 51. Apparently, John Young claims, this comes allegedly from a WikiLeaks insider, we don't know who, that up until April 2010, the total donations were $243,896. So that's just over 3 years. That's about £73,000 a year. But Assange claims it takes $200,000 just to keep the lights on and $600,000 to be fully funded. Right.
Yeah.
So it's not possible, if these figures are correct, for them to have survived through the donations they've had from this WikiLeaks insider. So they're getting money from somewhere else then.
Yeah.
And I'm not aware of any accounts ever being published. This is an organisation which goes on about being open and transparent and releasing everyone's private information, but doesn't produce any financial accounts or audits on its own organisation.
Right. Yeah, that's the situation.
Mm-hmm. Now, I've mentioned George Soros a number of times, and he's connected to a number of these organisations. Do you know much about Soros, Andrew?
I don't know an awful lot. I know that he has been connected to, he's even been connected to people like Stephen Greer and the Disclosure Project in terms of funding. So, you know, he's one of these figures that pops up a bit like Kissinger, you know, that he seems to have his finger in many pies, but mainly from a financial rather than a political angle, is my understanding.
Mm-hmm. Let me read this quote, page 93. Soros' fingerprints are all over the WikiLeaks project. For example, not only has Freedom House worked closely with Soros Open Society Institutes in promoting such projects as the Washington-financed 2005 Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan that brought the Washington-friendly dictator and drug boss Kurmanbek Bakayev to power, but WikiLeaks board member Ben Lorry, a former security boss of Google, is a director of Open Rights Group funded by Soros' front group, the Open Society Foundation. In a nutshell, WikiLeaks is packed with people who either work for Soros or are Soros collaborators. We know that Open Society Foundation was considered as one of the premier organisations to look for funds. So Soros funds sort of left-wing psy-ops, basically, that have a geopolitical intention. I advise people do their own research on George Soros and what his real motives may well be, but he's connected to Rothschilds and obviously the City of London and the whole
banking network banking families. Yeah.
Let's just cover now the actual mechanism of disclosure.
Yes.
Because WikiLeaks will accept documents just sent through the post. They've had various PO boxes. So if you've got a paper document, you make sure your fingerprints aren't on it, you send it to a PO box, right? But PO boxes can be infiltrated, and WikiLeaks, if they had a PO box, there would be nothing to stop intelligence agencies actually opening their mail, right? So that's not 100% secure. Now they have developed, they claim, a means by which people can go on their website and upload documents to them without the user then being identified with the certain protocols that they've developed. Now that may well be true. And another point to make is that you don't actually need a portal like this, a secure portal to leak documents. You don't need a PO box. All you need to do is you buy, let's say, a brand new laptop with cash, or you obtain a computer that's not linked to you. You go onto a wireless network, and then you open an email account under a different name to your own, and then you send the documents to a journalist or to me or to anyone in a like internet cafe.
That's right.
And then you chuck the laptop in the bin.
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't even need a laptop. You can do it with a phone now. You can get like a 20 quid phone that's got wireless internet on it, and then just chuck the phone in the bin.
Yeah.
You know.
So you can send terabytes of information that way.
Yes. Yeah.
Not that most leaks would consist of terabytes. Documents are very small in their nature in terms of, you're talking a few K. So you don't actually need this facility to leak something and still remain anonymous.
That's it. You know, we could also make a case about the blog that we discussed on the Mars rover program. That was essentially a leak, if that story was true, which appeared to be, and it was just on a blog. You know, the guy just anonymized it. Leaked.
Yeah. We don't know who he is.
No?
Yeah. You were just going to mention that really important VIP went to see Julian Assange. Who was that?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about the situation in the Ecuadorian embassy, which seemed to be pretty artificial. And I learned when I was, doing a bit of research for this program that Lady Gaga spent 5 hours with him. This was fairly recently, I think in the last couple of years. And so you'll find that. Sorry, and you also mentioned that...
Yeah, Pamela Anderson, I heard, was the other one.
Yeah. So
I wonder what he did with her.
Well, indeed, you know, yeah.
Mm. All right. So if let's just look at, because the leaks have come from very diverse areas. So you've got defence, banking, personal emails, foreign intelligence, congressional reports, Bilderberg meetings, Guantanamo Bay procedures, blah, 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 blah. So if it's been done via hacking, then it's someone's got very good knowledge of all these different systems. But we're led to believe it's whistleblowers. I find it hard to believe that someone like Bradley Manning would have access to so much information. I mean, maybe they do, I don't know.
You know, I mean, we can imagine that, I mean, the biggest intelligence gathering agencies are the CIA and the NSA. So we can imagine that WikiLeaks could be a portal for them to make stuff public in a way which they saw fit, you know, to influence public perception of the election campaign, or a certain, if they wanted to get a bank shut down for whatever reason, then if NSA had gathered information on that bank or their shareholders, they could front that through WikiLeaks and get that bank shut down.
Yeah, and they may have shut the country down of Iceland in that way.
Yeah, indeed, indeed.
Because there was the Icelandic banking collapse, and what happened there was WikiLeaks released a document after the collapse which kind of revealed how it happened, who was corrupt, who was funneling money here and there, and that then caused an outrage. But they then said, okay, well, WikiLeaks is now going to help us reform our information laws and our banking system. So WikiLeaks was actually involved in the governmental process in Iceland, allegedly, to help them reform their laws, which, does that sound right to you?
Absolutely.
Why, has he got a degree in law or finance? Not that I'm aware of. So it's just so unbelievable.
And on that sort of thing as well, I had a thought when he was in the Pilger interview again. He says, Assange actually says, WikiLeaks has been publishing for 10 years, 10 million documents, several thousand publications, several thousand different sources, and we've never got it wrong, he says. We've never got it wrong. So he's putting forward that they're just 100% reliable, but they're only as reliable as how truthful the documents that they release are. Mm-hmm. So if somebody leaks a fake document, or a document which has lies in it, they're leaking lies just like everyone else is. So for him to make a statement like that, it's ridiculous. Say, oh, we're never wrong. Well, you may have successfully leaked the documents, but are those documents accurate?
Mm-hmm. Here's a thing here that they've released in March 2008. WikiLeaks published what they referred to as the collected secret Bibles of Scientology. Mm-hmm. I mean, any comment on that?
Well, again, Scientology has come under fire, so if they want to manipulate people in Scientology or the public perception of it, again, WikiLeaks is a way of doing that.
Mm-hmm. And here's another comment, I've just highlighted this here. Sarah Palin's Yahoo email account contents in September 2008, some of Sarah Palin's emails. But apparently it was hacked into by members of Anonymous. And then at some point it was revealed publicly that the person who had hacked was David Kernel, a 22-year-old economics student at the University of Tennessee. So WikiLeaks seemed to have worked in conjunction with certain people from this anonymous movement, and there's a huge question mark over that movement. Indeed, as well, is there not?
Yeah, very much, yeah.
And whether it's another front stroke psy-op in order to handle the alternative dissent and alternative media and what have you.
Yes.
ClimateGate emails. Now, this is an interesting comment, because the ClimateGate emails, these were emails from the University of East Anglia, which showed that the scientists were fraudulently trying to big up the claims of climate increases.
Global warming, yeah.
But WikiLeaks didn't leak those ClimateGate emails. It says, WikiLeaks, although the information was not originally leaked by them, they've hosted some of those emails. So they've already been leaked out by someone else. So they'll put them on their server. Right, so they're not... So they kind of claiming credit for blowing the whistle on this ClimateGate thing, but not really. Bilderberg meeting reports from 1955, 56, 57, 58, 60, 62, 63 and 1980. So nothing really recent.
So they're probably trying to use that to enhance their credibility or enhance their role. And again, going back to the hackers that might be working for them, if these hackers really are ethical and they really are doing damage, and they go to WikiLeaks, then again they can be identified and dealt with accordingly. You know, either put in prison or made, you know, an offer which will get them to work for the very forces that they're trying to work against.
Here's another one which will interest you, Andrew. 9/11 pager messages. On the 25th of November 2009, WikiLeaks released 570,000 intercepts of pager messages sent on the day of the September the 11th attacks, right? So this is people obviously in panic. They've seen this thing happen. Now, all those text messages are going to do is reassert the official story, are they not? Because
Generally
really
speaking,
nobody
yeah.
on that day was questioning the official version.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there is, we're going off on a side issue here, but there is a slightly interesting thing that came out of those text messages, which was the reports of Hurricane Erin, which were automatic from a you know, weather service text. Those are quite interesting, but outside of that, yes, they're pretty much, you know, just not that much of a useful set of information for events on 9/11.
So it says here that when WikiLeaks released the Baghdad airstrike video in 5th of April 2010, in the week following the release, WikiLeaks was the search term with the most significant growth worldwide in the last 7 days as measured by Google Insights. So we've also got, briefly touch on the Afghan war logs. I think this was the first time that I woke up and attached any kind of importance to WikiLeaks, because I saw Assange giving his lecture when he was talking about these war logs, and I just thought, wow, this is 92,000 documents, and each one of the documents is a report on collateral damage from the ground. So it says, on this date and this time, we bombed this village. There was 7 villagers killed. We blew up 4 buildings. It took this long. This is how much ammunition was used. Right, and then okay, next one, and it's just like that. Thousands of documents, thousands of the Afghan war, and then they released the Iraq ones as well. And it was then I thought, you know, this is really big what they're releasing, which there's nothing parallels it in history in terms of the detail of a conflict. Not that many people have actually looked at them.
No,
but again, is this more like the emperor sticking the criminals' heads on the top of a pole and saying, look what we can do? Yeah. According to a report on the Daily Beast website, the Obama administration has asked Britain, Germany and Australia, among others, to consider bringing criminal charges against Assange for the Afghan war leaks and to help limit Assange's travel across international borders. In the United States, a joint investigation by the Army and the Federal Bureau of Investigation may try to prosecute. May try to prosecute. It's always this impending this ongoing investigation and impending prosecution.
Yeah, yeah.
He's been going 10 years, over 10 years. So perhaps we can just finish by assuming that we're correct. What's really the intention behind it, the real intention, and where they're trying to take it? You know, have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, you know, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, that it is like a new way of getting things into the public domain, where there is a level of, there's like a sort of a wall between the public and the information in terms of where does it come from, you know, who's leaked it.
There's cherry picking of the information.
I think so, yeah. And it's just that it's like, it's a bit hard to describe, but, you know, WikiLeaks is meant to be this kind of rebellious portal where people are doing things that they shouldn't be doing. So this whole idea of documents being leaked, you know, is quote unquote naughty, whereas stuff being in the newspaper isn't quite the same. You know, in other words, it's like the way that this information is being accessed is, you know, you ask questions about whether it's ethical or not, you know, and that isn't quite the same with the mainstream. The way that information comes through WikiLeaks is it's tainted. It's tainted in some way. I find it difficult to describe, but that's what again, going back to a Guardian article, that it's becoming the way that journalism will work.
Because obviously they have to make it look like what it's claimed to be. They can't be too. They have to release information which is real and true. It's real people's emails, and people have to believe that they're this renegade organisation which is going against the establishment. So they have to be careful not to be too, let's say, in one direction in what they're doing if they want to create this one world government, because they released some stuff which was trying to demonise Putin at one point, where they were saying, oh, he's built this with all of this corrupt money that he's stolen. He's building a new palace for himself or whatever. Isn't it terrible? But I think they've ended up having to step back on demonising Putin. I don't think it worked to perhaps how they wanted it to.
Right.
So I think that's one of the main agendas, to all of the regimes that they really want to take control of, or regime change. It's helping with those. It's helping get the psi information into the person's mind about those regimes first, before you do know what I mean? Rather than just using the mainstream media for that.
Right. The other thing which I just remembered was with the Amy Goodman interview, the one where he's in the embassy and she's in the studio. Right at the end of that interview, he starts to talk about the deep state, and he also mentions the military-industrial complex. And that, to me, was starting to get a bit more interesting. But then that's the end of the interview, and he doesn't really get a chance to talk about that. So that, you know, again, I would have been interested to know what he was going to say about that, and how he was going to spin it based on, you know, what we've been discussing in this programme.
There was one other quote that I wanted to read from Daniel Esterlin's book, and it's concerned with mind control. Yeah. So there's a CIA mind control specialist called Dr. Ewan Cameron, and we've spoken about him with Neil Sanders. And he is alleged to have quoted this, that he believed that every person is the ultimate arbiter of justice in their own conscience, right? And in one of Assange's interviews, he's alleged to have said, "We favour and uphold ethical behaviour in all circumstances. We do not believe in unquestioning obedience to authority in all circumstances. Every person is the ultimate arbiter of justice in their own conscience." So he quoted Ewan Cameron, the CIA mind control doctor, exactly in those words. That might not mean anything, but just...
It is unusual, isn't it? Yeah.
Is has he read Ewan Cameron's work, or if so, why? So I think we've covered enough for one session, Andrew, and we may well come back to this. I'm sure there'll be lots of feedback on this show. And remember, believe none of what you hear, including from WikiLeaks, and only half of what you see. I'm Richard D. Hall. Good night.